This is Paul Jenkins, and you're listening to the Reluctant Leader Podcast. Now, I believe two things are true. One, everyone leads someone. And two, no one really feels qualified to lead anyone. So maybe you feel overlooked, unqualified, invisible. But the good news is, in the Bible and in life, the most qualified aren't always the most obvious. Hey friends, listen, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Reluctant Leader Podcast. I'm Paul Jenkins, of course, and today we're chatting with a good friend of mine, David Docusen. I knew him as a pastor because he was pastoring when we met, but now he's a professor and an author. He is an advocate for all kinds of things that you've been reading about, but maybe have been afraid to talk about. And he's the author of a book called Neighborliness, which came out a while back, but is getting ready to relaunch. I'll let you share more about that, David, if you want to. And it's just an awesome honor to have you hanging out with me because you're busy, man. I appreciate you taking the time to just chat for a little bit. So welcome.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, it's good to have you here.
Well, I'm excited to be here, man. I love you. I love your ministry. I love what you're doing. And I love this topic of reluctant leaders. I think that when you first told me about the idea of this podcast, it resonated deeply within me because I think that anybody that is honest with themselves generally don't always feel up to the task. And if you always feel up to the task of what you're doing, then I would have a hard time following somebody like that. So
yes, that's fun. I mentioned that in when I was kind of doing some teasers for the podcast, like people that are really quick to rush into leadership, they scare me.
Yeah.
It's a huge responsibility. And so I know it's not one that you take lightly either.
No.
I'm gonna let you, I'm just gonna be quiet and let you talk as much as you want to about this, because I know some of your story and I know the twists and turns that you've experienced, just kind of going from pastoring to what you're doing now. Just take a few minutes and share, what you can about that and just some of the reluctance that you fought through as you were saying yes to all that God's doing right now.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the things that I hope kind of shines through is like, we're genuinely friends. And so I hope that people can sense that and feel that. And so because of that, because you know some of my story, please interject at any point. But I mean, the highlights are, I've been in full-time ministry for 22 years now, and just a lot of it local church. 19 years of it was in local church ministry, and church planted 2 churches in Charlotte, North Carolina, did 10 years as an associate minister down at a church in Orlando, Florida, and then kind of going all the way back, just reverse engineering everything here. Grew up until elementary school outside of Detroit. And every one of those seasons of life like really formed and shaped me. But I tell you what, man, it was the experience of planting our second church in Charlotte, which is where you and I really started to build the actual friendship. We knew each other from before that, but really, I think it was even a lot of this topic, Paul, was both of us found in each other a friend that was willing to say, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And we were both planting churches right around the same time. And you guys were planting the Gathering, and we were planting a church called Center City Church. And, we would either meet up in Charlotte or, in your hometown of Albemarle, and meet up halfway sometimes and just talk about how hard ministry can be and how much joy there is in it, and celebrate. And there's been times where we got together and just cried. We've been pissed off at times together. We've been, like all the wide ranging gamut of emotions. And for me, it was moving our church family from an affluent, predominantly white community in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, to right on the dividing line on the other side of uptown Charlotte between affluent and white, literally on one side of the street, and predominantly African-American and poor on the other side of the street, and then stretching for several miles. There was just it was a line of poverty and wealth. It was unbelievable. And the Lord just really started to open my eyes, not through academic work or reading books, but through relationships of just the brilliance of the folks that were coming from this high poverty community. I hadn't had a ton of exposure in real deep relationships across dividing lines. Really, if I reflect honestly now, after 7 or 8 years of this journey, I really didn't have a lot of genuine relationships across racial and economic lines, to the point that somebody would be really honest with me about their experience of growing up as a person of color in our country, or growing up, lower middle class or lower class economically in our country. And I think that we had initially moved, Paul, from one side of the city to the other. We were a few hundred people. Financially, the church was healthy. Some good, really beautiful things happening in the church. And when we moved, I thought to myself, man, we're going to be a real blessing to this community. And I think that's the inclination of somebody who just doesn't have a clue what they're talking about. Is you just think that whatever you're going to bring is going to be a benefit to whatever community that you go to. And I learned out very quickly that actually I was the one that needed to learn, and I was the one that needed to grow. And the same way that I was instinctively pastoring in a community that was slowly but surely growing, kind of year after year, there was no explosive growth, but it was healthy. The same way that I was pastoring people wasn't going to work across these lines, because I had no reservoir to pull from of experience or compassion or care, because I hadn't relationally been exposed, nor did I, if I'm being very honest, nor did I care to cross those dividing lines. I just thought that people would come to us and that we would give what God had given to us to others.
Yeah.
And what really changed my perspective is when I started to realize that there was a whole community of people that I was supposed to humbly pause and listen and learn and grow from. And so the book that you mentioned, Neighborliness, Love Like Jesus, Cross Dividing Lines, Transform Your Community, came out on March 15th, 2022. That actually was written 2 years ago in a different form. And the book came out right around the same time that George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And it was just self-published. It was published through my just some of my connections with my agent. And God just really used it, because it was kind of, a timely message to talk about crossing dividing lines. And it just shared a lot of stories of what I learned growing up, literally, as, in my mid 30s, I was now starting to grow up into what God had probably intended all along for my life, which was to really carry out both sides of the greatest commandment, to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think that we do a pretty good job of that one for the most part in the church, orienting programs around that. What I started to realize is that we don't have a stated ethic or a framework for what does it mean to love our neighbors that are different than us.
Yeah.
And so, neighborliness kind of took off, whatever that means, enough to grab the attention of HarperCollins Christian Publishing, and then they picked up the book, and we are re-releasing it, and God's used it literally all over the world, which is just insane. And so that's just kind of some of the origin story of that message, and so excited to see what God is doing. I mean, if people are interested, you can go to neighborliness.com and check out tons of free resources for churches and leaders and organizations, businesses. We created a bunch of practical resources that we're now using all over the world to kind of spark conversations about stuff that I think we should have been talking about all along in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll link all that stuff in our show notes too, just so people can find it.
Yeah.
I want to say to the people that are listening, I've listened to podcasts like this where you hear an author start talking about their book, and it's like, oh, it's just a big advertisement. And what I love about you, and this is what the beauty of being friends is. I think of that verse I think it's in 1 Peter that talks about hiding yourself under God's hand, and in due time he'll lift you up. And I've watched that, kind of a backseat perspective of how you have humbled yourself. And that's hard to do, right? I mean, I think when George Floyd happened, when that whole thing went down, I've not talked to anybody who wasn't drastically moved to their core by that moment. But I've talked to a lot of people who it was just a moment, and they didn't humble themselves and say, God, not what do you want me to bring to the table, but what do I need to learn from what I just saw? And you've done that. And it feels like every time we talk, which isn't enough, I could talk to you all the time, every time we talk, something new is happening, and it's just God raising you up. And it's because the message he's given you, one, it's so necessary. And two, man, David, you're so authentic. And I think that's when I think of reluctance in leadership, I guess I'm not reluctant to lead. Like, we can go read a leadership book and do principles and, get a crowd, but it's the authenticity of it. Like, really saying, this is what I know and this is what I don't know, and finding people that will go along on that journey. There's a cost involved in that, and it's not a fun cost to pay.
No.
So
one of the thoughts that I had, Paul, as you were saying that, is the times that I feel most confident in leadership are moving people towards things that I'm very certain about. And I'm like, I can envision this, I can see point A to point B. The reluctance comes in when I don't feel qualified, or I don't feel like the right person to say it, or I don't feel like, like the right voice for that moment. But it's in those moments, like, I don't want to take people from where I know we are to where I know we can be. I want to move past those moments into the places that are full of mystery and, full of the mystery of God. And if I'm super confident in leading people into the mystery of God, then I don't understand the mystery of God.
Right.
And so I mean, I appreciate all of those things that you said, about my leadership and stuff like that. But, I would say that, my response to all this, the circumstances that arose, a global awareness in a way that we haven't seen since the 50s and 60s of social issues. When all of that was happening, I didn't find myself like running around being like, oh, I could talk to you about this. I could talk to you about this. What I found myself wanting to do is I've studied this stuff quite a bit. I've looked into this stuff. For those of the listeners that don't know, I did my doctoral work studying generational poverty and community development. How do we help move families out of poverty and into sustainability, and studied racial and economic injustice in that. What I wanted to do in that moment wasn't like, oh, everybody come listen to me talk about, racial reconciliation. I wanted to point people to people that I was learning from. And I think that is a posture of the heart that I had to learn, because I think in my 20s and 30s, I probably wanted to be an expert on something. And, getting into my 40s and being punched in the mouth a couple of times, I think that I more realized, you know what, like, I want to point people to the people that I'm learning from.
Yeah.
And if somebody wants to know my opinion, that's cool. Like, if they want to know some of the things that I've learned along the way, I mean, I've got 20 years in the industry now. So, I mean, I've got a few things that I can say, but I want to open the door for particularly women and people of color that are speaking into matters of inequality.
Yeah.
Like, I want to open the doors for people to hear from, amazing leaders that are living the experience that we're trying to talk about. And so, a lot of people have asked me, I mean, like, you're a white guy in the racial justice space, economic justice space. Don't you think that that space should be reserved for people of color and women who have experienced that type of being overlooked or passed over and stuff? And I'm like, absolutely. But I think that we need more white people in the conversation, participating and showing deference and showing that we can, like, point to others within that conversation with a humble heart. And I think that it's in that, when you're not just trying to point to yourself all the time, I think that people will keep coming back to that source, because it's not just like, hey, listen to that expert. It's, hey, these are a few of the things I'm learning, but I'm not actually real good at this all the time.
Right.
But here's some people that I've learned from. And now all of a sudden you've started to participate in this ecosystem of, like, the people of God, and trying to, like Ephesians 4 talks about, that we mature into the body and the head, which is Christ. And so it means that I need you, and we need the listeners of this podcast, and we need all of us together to mature into the fullness, that which is Christ. And yeah, so I mean, to me, I feel the most confident when I know stuff. I feel super what's the opposite? Unconfident, not confident?
I think unconfident's the word. It is now.
Unconfident. It is now. It don't matter. But certainly the title of this podcast, Reluctant. I feel reluctant all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't even have any problem saying that. I think it's a natural human emotion.
Sure. Oh, well, especially, when the task is huge, right? And
yeah,
again, we're a little older, so I'm not in my 20s and 30s, but
a smidge. We're a smidge old. We're a smidge older.
That's why this is not a video podcast, right?
That's right. That's right.
But when I was younger, I think I really did wholeheartedly believe I was big enough for anything.
Yeah.
And then the longer you live, you see, and it doesn't have to be an issue like racial reconciliation or whatever big words we want to put there. Just being a human being and exhibiting Christ likeness is a big freaking task.
Yes.
And it should make us think, oh God, I'm not sure. Yeah. Like, my brother is better, send him, right?
Mm-hmm.
I resonate more and more with Moses the older that I get. There's got to be people that can write a better book, preach a better sermon, and use them. And I just think God is looking for people who just simply say, well, here's what I've got, take it and use it. And
I think it's important too. I mean, my favorite thing to talk about is the Bible, especially in the work that I do, because I refer to it as biblical justice. I mean, I'm all about social justice. I'm all about racial and economic justice. I just refer to it as biblical justice because, I think that people identify, they want to hear the stories about Joshua leading the people, circling the city 7 times, and the walls came down, everybody's throwing their fists in the air like Braveheart. I don't even know if that's a relevant reference anymore, but it's a movie. And everybody screams freedom, and like they feel all excited. But what a lot of people want to skip over is that when that leadership went from Moses to Joshua, so Moses had that reluctance. When Joshua felt the call to move into the promised land, his response was like, and then it took 3 times in Joshua chapter 1, God saying to him, be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
And then he still didn't get it. And at the end of Joshua chapter 1, he sends people from a whole nother tribe to come wander over to him with the same exact message. And it says, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Now, the last time I checked, if somebody is like overconfident, the last thing I'm trying to do is pump them up more.
Right.
So if you just read that with a bit of common sense, that means that Joshua needed to be emboldened. It means that he was reluctant, very reluctant, to say, yeah, I'll lead 600,000 people or whatever it was, across this river and into the promised land. I think that it's way more natural for people to feel reluctance than we like to preach about.
Yeah.
It doesn't preach so good going into lunch on a Sunday morning to make people lean into their insecurities and acknowledge it as much as it does. You can overcome and you can do this and da 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 da. But what the reality is that most people, whether you're going to the bank that you work at or raising the kid as a stay-at-home mom or dad or whatever it is, we don't feel confident all the time in the things that God is calling us to do. Whether it's vocation or life or relationships or whatever it may be. And I think that the Bible is full of, it's okay to be human. I mean, the Psalms are just full of people just complaining and lamenting and just whining, I don't feel good enough, or who am I? And yet we like to pull out the things that feel like the ending of a good movie, instead of realizing that any good movie is going to have the dip in the middle, where it's like, it's the crisis moment or the insecurity or the fractured relationship. Those are the things that make a great story. And so I think that what acknowledging reluctance does is it makes for a good life.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about something I probably can't remember enough to talk about, but we'll give it a shot. I'm in the middle of Brene Brown's new book called Atlas of the Heart. And for listeners that aren't familiar with Brene Brown, I always say that she's a woman from Texas who loves Jesus and loves to cuss. So just know, if you listen to her books, and I always listen because she's such a great narrator. Have you done an audiobook, by the way?
I did. Yeah.
Did you read it?
It's such a fun process.
Did you read it? So, I love when authors read their stuff and can actually read it. So I'll have to check yours out. But she's talking about quoting, she's like you, she just quotes all these people that are smarter than she is as well. And she's pretty smart.
She's brilliant. Yeah.
But one of the quotes that really stood out to me, and this is so important in today's society because we're an either or society now. Yep. We're so divided, is that it takes a level of emotional health to be able to say both and, to be able to hold a paradox and say, I don't know how these can both coexist, but they can. And so in the church, you know, when we say things like, hey, we always overcome, we always triumph, then how we've set ourselves up in a place where we can't really even navigate what seems like failure, or, you know, what seems like a loss, when we've told ourselves, well, with good Christians always overcome. And man, I think we're missing a whole avenue of God's power, because Paul said that it's in his weakness that Christ's power is made perfect. So like it's weakness that does that, not my strength. God doesn't need me to have 1 million listeners on the podcast, although I'll take them.
We'll take it.
A vessel to say, use me and don't give me any credit. And when he gets that, it's amazing what he can do. But you got to be willing to hold those both of those things at the same time. Wendy and I say all the time, it's both and, it's not either or, it's both and. And the world, you see this especially, the world is trying to divide us so much. You're either you're Democrat, you're Republican, you're whatever, you're for CRT, or you think it's a hoax. I mean, and so and you can't have any conversations if you're always divided. You've got to be able to come to the table with humility and just talk and not have to be right. Just be real, right? And just have a conversation. And I so appreciate that about you.
Well, I think one of the things that I have learned as well, you know, the idea of both and is, if we really want to pursue the fullness, which maybe we'll never get there, but the fullness of the greatest commandment, love God with everything and love your neighbor as you would love yourself. So if you're loving God with everything and he first loved you, then I should love my neighbor that same way too, across dividing lines. So the Luke 10 passage goes from that command right into the story of the Good Samaritan, which was crossing religious and economic and, you know, like tons of dividing lines, cultural lines. And so when I think about trying to fulfill both sides of the greatest commandment, I've actually found myself liberated when I'm able to publicly say that I still struggle with things across dividing lines. I don't understand everything. I have some of the same thoughts that I grew up with, even after 7 years of exploring this and doing a doctoral program and writing 2 books now, and you know, seeing so many of these I mean, I do this full time every day, traveling around the country in different parts of the world talking about this stuff. I still struggle with my natural inclination of the way that I was raised about people that are different than me. And what happens is I have started to, how do I want to say this? You got me all vulnerable, Paul. I have to realize that when I hear somebody say, I don't have a racist bone in my body, I have to find a way to help that person see, yeah, you do, you know, like we all do. And if that just means that the enemy is doing everything that he can to divide us, make us feel different, it means that, like, you know, racism is just this division, right? It's like a class thing where you try and get somebody to make them less than you so you can be more than somebody. We are all wired in our human nature to feel like we're better than somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was sitting in a church service one time, and the pastor looked out and said, "Who do you think you're better than?" And he said, "Don't fly past that conversation. Who do you think you're better than?" And everybody was dead silent in the room. That's not the way you grow a church, by the way.
Yeah.
By asking hard questions like that. And what I feel like the Lord has gotten me to is that I can deeply care about justice, and I can deeply care about establishing the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And I can still be wrestling with things that I have embedded in me from the time that I was growing up. And I grew up in a working class family. that was very, very hard on people in lower economic classes because we didn't have a lot, but we worked hard for what we earned, right?
Right.
And so I have, 20 something years of being raised, or 20 years of being raised in a home that would look down on others that seemingly weren't working hard. Well, that takes a while to flesh out. It takes a while. And no matter how much I care and how much I love, it's the both and of like, if I don't acknowledge this, it can't be healed.
Right.
If I don't allow the Lord into those spaces, it can't be healed. And if I don't acknowledge it, then the people that I'm trying to build relationships with, they're going to feel it anyway.
Yeah.
So are my new friendships strong enough for me to be honest and say, man, that's really challenging a way that I'm thinking. I just think that when we don't acknowledge that there is this both and of trying to work through the tension of racial and economic division, you can still deeply care and make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. I like to say a lot that God exposes things that he wants to heal. Right.
Yeah.
And obviously the last couple of years, he has used COVID and other situations to expose a lot from maybe from your perspective. What do you think he's trying to expose in the American church so he can heal it?
Yeah, I think that the American church, and I mean, Paul, we've traveled to multiple countries in 31 states over the last 18 months. So this is like I now have like a bird's eye view snapshot of lots of different places. And I think that the American church, I think that we're experiencing the baby of getting in bed with a corporate expression of the pursuit of position, power, finances, all of these things. And so what I mean by that is if the goal is growth, and if the goal is has got some sort of a conqueror's mentality over a city, like with all this language that we grew up with, I'm going to take this city. Well, it was never yours to take in the first place. We're supposed to establish the kingdom and call forth the kingdom of God. It's not militaristic. It is establishing an other kingdom.
Yeah.
But when we go too far into capitalism as it relates to the church, now all of a sudden I'm not willing to talk about racial and economic stuff other than maybe mentioning it for a moment, like you said, when the rest of the world is mentioning it.
Right.
I'm not willing to do that because it's going to make people leave or people are going to get upset. And now all of a sudden we're pulling punches on the gospel message. Now, the reason that we're pulling the punch is because we've defined success in the same way that we corporatized, I've made up another word, maybe, the kingdom of God as local churches that found success in influence, power, and money. And if we're not careful, the baby that is now being born out of that, which is fearful pastors and fearful leaders that aren't willing to say the costly message of true and unadulterated and unfiltered kingdom language and gospel language. I think that we've got to be really careful about the deception that has now covered our eyes that makes us believe that success is growth, influence, power, Instagram followers, social media influence. I mean, even in my world now, I'm an author and everybody wants to talk about platform. Everybody wants to know, well, how big is your platform? And I'm a living, breathing story that if God wanted to get a message out, he'll use an unexpected messenger, because I don't have the platform to be in the rooms that I'm in right now. And so I'm not saying that to point at myself. I'm just saying God knows how to get his own message out. We just have to be faithful to the truth. And I think that what's happening in the church is that we have prostituted ourselves to give ourselves over to something that is other than the kingdom. So I don't know if you wanted that answer, but that's my answer, is what I'm seeing in the church.
No, I think it's a good answer. What I kept thinking about where you're talking was, we'll have to have you come back for another episode or 2 or 5 or 10, because it's such a huge topic. It's not even as simple as, well, let's just stop having social media accounts as pastors so we don't get caught up in celebrity status, because it's a heart thing. And if it's not social media, then it'll be some other outlet, because we have to bow the knee of our pride at the cross. And that's the hardest thing to do. I mean, even going full circle back to the beginning, when we walk into a situation and think that because we are people who are the majority, we bring the solution, that's pride, right? That's like pride. We have to walk in humbly and just simply say, I want to have a conversation and I want to learn. And it doesn't mean that we're agreeing with everything that's said or that we expect them to agree with everything. It's just, hey, can we develop a relationship, and can we see God do something through that could potentially not give me a city so that I can say I took a city, like you said, but so that we can see the kingdom established here. What does the kingdom of God look like in this local area? Man, if we had that heart, we could see some things changed. And I love that about you. I could talk to you all day. You can't talk to me all day because you got stuff to do. But I so appreciate the time, just hearing what's going on with you and kind of where you are, the doors that God's opening. Super excited for what God's doing through you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Listen, I know you mentioned the book already, but if you want to, just tell us one more way, just how people can get in touch with you. I know we just talked about talking about Instagram and all that stuff, but are there some very specific ways that people can find out more? Because I think people want to learn more about this topic, even though if they're honest, it scares the snot out of them, because none of us feel adequate for this task. Yeah.
Well, the good news is that Neighborliness was written with that person in mind. I hope that it is engaging enough to make you think, but also make you laugh, and then also make you go, that guy made a bunch of mistakes. Because I kind of cut myself open and let myself bleed a little bit, and showed a lot of the mistakes that I think are really common that a lot of well-meaning and well-intentioned people make as they're trying to cross dividing lines. So hopefully it is a very engaging book that is just full of a lot of stories. And so I hope it makes people think too. And then ultimately, I always say I want this to be a message of discipleship. I want it to be about being formed more into the image of Jesus, not into a social justice image. I want it to be biblical justice. I want to see God, I want to see God smile about his bride, and the bride of Christ, to see the church be beautiful. Unbelievably, I'm still getting used to saying this. I kind of I don't know what to do with my hands, I feel a little awkward about this, but it's literally available kind of everywhere, like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Target, Walmart, Amazon. Bulk orders from churches can be made at churchsource.com. And we wrote a 30-page guide. If any of your listeners, I haven't done this for anybody yet, but if any of your listeners want me to send, I have a 30-page booklet that I wrote called Neighborliness in Your Church. That's a free resource on our website, but I've actually got books of it. I'll send it to anybody for free. That is one of your listeners. And it just shows pastors and ministry leaders and organizational leaders how to spark these conversations across their whole organization and across their whole church. So if somebody wanted to do like a 6-week sermon series with small groups and stuff like that, all of that is on neighborliness.com, which is a mouthful, but I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes. And we just have a lot of resources on there, like, community-wide prayer gatherings, how to lead those and aim towards justice. We've got, prepackaged small group materials, and then, for people that want to be really crazy, I help organizations create community development, holistic plans for communities on how to make an equitable community with access to education, employment, healthcare, and housing for communities. So that's what my doctoral work was in. So if the shorter version is neighborliness.com.
Okay.
And then there's a bunch of tabs on there.
Yeah. And we'll try to point people as much as we can to that website and just all the resources. So even you guys listen to David say, hey, we'll give you this booklet. I mean, that's your heart. That's the David that I've known. And we just applaud what God's doing through you. And our heart, even with this podcast, is we talked about platforms. God told me specifically, you build a platform and you put other people on it. And it's just been an honor for us to talk with you. It's even more of an honor to call you friend. And so I appreciate you just.
Absolutely.
Man, we started a podcast just so you and I could catch up.
Absolutely. I love it.
I didn't even ask you the toughest question, which toughest question has to be like, how have you grown up with the last name Docusen, which is actually spelled like it's not pronounced? Like, has that been hard for you, awkward for you?
So yeah, I mean, like kindergarten was awful, like trying to spell your name. That it's actually a story that goes into American exceptionalism, because my great grandfather moved here from the Philippines, checked into America, and like, hey, I'm here. It was spelled Ducisin, which is a bit better. Docusen, you can at least see it.
Yeah.
And the guy who checked in, my illiterate grandfather, who was a fisherman teenager, didn't know anything about spelling. He said, that doesn't look American enough. And the dude changed our name, changed the spelling of our name. So the pronunciation is the same. And that guy must have not been able to spell either, because I am related to every Docusen on the face of the earth with that spelling, because somebody made it up because they didn't think it looked American enough.
Man, you were literally born to do what you're doing.
I'm literally born to avenge my family name. Yes.
Gosh, that's fantastic. All right, so listen, we will have you back at a future date and just kind of catch up again with what's going on. Thanks so much for being a part of this today.
All right, man. Hey, and all you guys out there, spread the word about this podcast. It's important. Share it, like it, blah, blah, blah. Go.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, you do that. Do what the author said.
That's right. All right, brother.
All right. Thanks again, David.
Yeah, man.
You've been listening to the Reluctant Leader Podcast. Thanks so much for being a part of this conversation. You can follow us at the reluctantleaderpodcast.com or wherever you download your podcast. Be sure that you subscribe and like us and leave us a rating and a comment. We'd love to hear from you and hear what God's showing you. And remember this, no matter how reluctant you feel, keep saying yes, and He'll do the rest.